I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trilogue project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trilogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. My guest today is Anastasia Likhacheva, Dean of the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics.
Absolutely true.
Well, very good. I'm glad I got the title right.
It's extremely long title, so we try to shut it up like a world faculty or something like this because it's too hard to mix all this economics and affairs in one sentence, usually.
Well, the world is also pretty big. Rubio said that there are extremely interesting possibilities for economic cooperation.
Well, it's very interesting, even if we forget about all that happened in our bilateral relations for the last 10 years. Even before economic aspect of Russian-American relations, it was very weak. There were some energy projects, there were some representation of American service companies, finance, IT, consulting, whatever, but it was so far from U.S. economic presence in Asia. I don't speak about Europe or Latin America. But so we'll see. Maybe they have some ideas how to relaunch everything.
But you're saying that there's not much to relaunch, that even in the good days, there was not much American economic presence in Russia.
Reinvent the formats of Russian-American cooperation.
So let's talk about sanctions.
I recently found our materials of 2016 when we started our sanction research program at the faculty.
And that's as a result of the sanctions imposed after 2014.
Yeah, it wasn't popular and most of people was like, why, what for do you study it? It's going to be rearranged soon somehow. And all ideas that we have to study Iranian experience, that we have to study Chinese experience in the 90s, they were like, well, we shouldn't to be truly deep into that. And in this forecast, there was some analysis, like when most of Russian banks could be cut off from SWIFT, for example. And our forecast was it can happen only on a very severe shock in bilateral relations, mostly related to military clash involving Russia.
So this is in a report that you were writing in 2016?
Yes, and I was very sad to refund it in 2022. So if we take a look on American sanction policy everywhere, it was pretty logical that after the events that happened in February 2022 and in March, it can be just one package and that's it. So the whole logic of American sanction campaigns of last 35 years is that if US starts sanctioning, they continue. And they try and involve as much countries as partners as possible. They try to build coalitions. If it's possible to do via United Nations, good. If no, ad hoc coalitions with that's what happened with Russian campaign with Europeans, Japan, Korea, and Singapore and Micronesia.
But so you saw the first round of sanctions and were ready for many more.
Yeah.
Because that is the general rhythm of application of sanctions.
For me, a really shocking moment was the explosion of Nord Stream. So when sanctions were mixed with hardware. Also, when Europeans became very active in not just following American sanctions, but in introduction of some sanctions. That really ruined some of stereotypes that Europe deserves to cooperate with Russia, and just the very dominant nature of US foreign policy doesn't allow Europeans to marry with Russian economy and prosper. And then we realized that it doesn't look so clear. So that was the most intriguing moment here.
So in the post-2014 work that you had done on sanctions and anticipation, or at least preparation for possible future American sanctions on Russia, you expected the United States to be the most aggressive actor, for Europe to have incentive not to fully follow along. And so you were surprised by how enthusiastically the Europeans embraced the sanctions policy. And you mentioned Nord Stream. What do you mean by hardware?
Usually we try to divide that sanctions is a tool of foreign policy that countries apply, trying to avoid other military tools. But de facto, in most cases, if sanctions really matter something in bilateral relations and they are considered by a sanctions side, it usually mixed with some either direct military pressure or relative military pressure. So if Germany would just sanction import of Russian gas, it would be one story. When also 3 or 4 pipelines were destroyed, it was another environment for sanction application.
Sanctions by other means. So this is in some ways analogous to the history of sanctions with respect to Iran. Iran is the target of sanctions, but there is also a certain amount of sabotage that accompanies the sanctions.
Definitely.
Of their nuclear facilities and...
with Iran, it was de facto what happened with Iran. So Americans pushed a lot Europeans to follow the sanctions and others. And whenever it was possible, Europeans tried to swing from these sanction campaigns. And from 2014 to 2022, it was more or less a similar story with Russia. And then it was a very profound change.
So from 2014 to 2022, there were American sanctions on Russia, but the Europeans were attempting to maintain economic relations as much as possible.
And try to mitigate somehow American sanction compliance. Of course, some European companies limited their presence in Russia after 2014, obviously, but it's incomparable to the scale of 2022.
Yeah, and after 2022 is the reverse. The Europeans have been much more aggressive than the Americans. European companies left Russia much more completely than American companies have.
American companies also did, and especially some European companies have an American presence in their stakeholder structure. That was the key European sanctioners, de facto sanctioners. For example, private family-owned European companies, they tried to stay in Russia as much as possible, and it was some part of international, transnational conglomerate with American presence in any forms. So these companies were pretty active in leaving Russia, in canceling.
Do you know what prompted them to leave so abruptly? Was it fear of legal or economic repercussions or of reputational damage?
I think it's a mix. For some companies, for some Swedish companies, it were both reputational aspect regarding their domestic markets and their domestic political situation, and the share of American markets in their revenues. So we analyzed the logic of these withdrawing companies. Most of them had some economic concerns or economic rationale here. So very few of them really were like, we just don't want to deal with Russia anymore. There were that kind of companies, but not so much. And some of them started to come back very silently, but like in half a year, in a year. But many of them still work abroad.
And the ones that started coming back half a year or year after the full-scale invasion, as we call it in the U.S., did they come back because they realized that Russian policies wouldn't be so punitive or that American sanctions wouldn't be so total? If they left for economic reasons, what economic reasons brought them back in?
First, they realized that some competitors stayed and continued to work. If we speak especially about retail, FMCG sector, these segments weren't sanctioned directly. They weren't sectors that were on the sanction list. So it was more about concerns in how to redirect revenues, how to set up financial flows between Russia and major headquarters, that kind of things. When they found some ways or found partners that represent their interests here under the same brand, well, they started to profit again from the market. Because also, if we take a look on forecast in March 2022, so Russian economy should be ruined in weeks or months, and then it didn't happen. Russian economy started to grow.
But why didn't it happen, and what did you expect to happen when suddenly there's this massive war, which even Russians didn't expect because it was presumably supposed to be over quickly? Nobody expected it to take this long and take this long.
And we try to, I like this example as a case when any expertise doesn't work properly. There were no any proper forecasts of the dynamics of Russian GDP for coming years. No, both from American, from European institutions, from IMF, from Russian research bodies, where lots of smart people work. Basically the smartest, especially in economic forecasts. But all the models they use, they are not adjusted to profound shocks. The same with pandemics. Actually, in the spring 2020, nobody really managed to foresee what's going to happen with global trade and global GDP of major countries during the pandemic year.
Were these totally different disruptions, or did the experience of the pandemic prepare Russia for the sanctions that came after the start of the war?
Well, the one thing that probably is similar with pandemic experience is unusual, non-standard practices of very intense dialogue between government, between official bodies and business. That was what worked during the pandemics when everything is disrupting. So we need some other tools and speed of problem resolutions. And that helped, but I think nobody expected it's going to work in this way. Both business and government. So Russian business managed to redirect lots of flows and trade activities and investment activities very fastly, much faster than what that was expected by sanctioning countries. Nobody expected that Russia would redirect its trade towards Asia so fastly and in such huge scale. Now about 73% of Russian foreign trade is trade with Asia. No matter, for example, if part of this goods still comes from Germany or other countries, but still all services, logistics goes through Asia.
But some of that is only on paper, presumably.
Oh, wow. God bless paper.
Yeah, paper has done a lot for human civilization. But so how was Russian business capable of such flexible reorientations? Because this is a country not known for quick movements, adaptable bureaucracies, right? I mean, the idea is that it's sort of a big, clunky system that moves slowly, that has a lot more friction than flexibility. So was this adaptability always inherent, always visible, or was this a response to totally catastrophic circumstances?
That's the key. I think if we speak about the speed of adaptation, a Russian business that grown up for the last 35 years, its education curve was based on catastrophic changes and on catastrophic shifts. So when one country disappears and completely other country appears, when we just started to rearrange something and then in 7 years of new Russia, we have a default and financial crisis.
Give us specific examples, because country appears, disappears is a little confusing.
First, you start thinking about some business activities living in USSR. Then you wake up and next day there is no USSR anymore. There are 16 countries and you live in the biggest one, but still it's different country, different bureaucracy, different ideology, different everything. Then you enjoy hyperinflation. Then when you...
enjoy is an interesting term.
Oh, well, irony is part of our culture code. And then you just started to reconfigure something, rediscover the world or whatever, business practices. And then 1998, Asian financial crisis, that in Russia is never considered as Asian financial crisis. It's our financial crisis and default when many people who just started their businesses, they faced really very difficult period when dollars jumped from 5 rubles to 20 and 25 rubles in a couple of weeks. That's just preparatory school for Russian business. And then next 20 years, they started to learn how to do business in global world. And some of them learned. So when they first faced the shock of 2020, they remembered some of their practices and instincts from the very beginning. And then,
but a lot of time had gone by since the 1985 to 96 decade.
Not so much.
From the outside, it looked like there's just all the pipelines had been built, the gas was flowing, the money was going to London along with the children of those who own the pipelines, and that everybody was happy with a pretty stable system.
Yeah, but then we realized that we have more than 2 pipelines that go to Europe. Obviously more than 2, 3 in Nord Stream were exploded. And we have the whole world around, and we don't really know how to work with it. And it's really lots of people that already can pay for services. We started to work on pivot to the east before it became fashionable. And it was very hard in 2010 to explain why we have to consider more work with China as a prosperous market. And from economic point of view, it was so obvious. You're showing figures and you say, hey, guys, they grown up like by 2-digit pass every year. And we have the longest land border with them. And we have so many things they need, not just oil and gas and resources. We have water. We can produce water-intense goods and sell food for them, sell paper or whatever. And not speaking about technologies, they also could be interested in. And most of the logic was, it's right, but what for? We have Zurich, we have London, we have pipelines, and we have oil, $120 per barrel. But some projects were launched before. So if we didn't start any attempts to balance our relations with Europe, mostly economically with Europe, till 2022, the consequences would be much harder. And all the efforts at the presidential level, like relations with Xi, relations with Modi, it also played its role. Relations with the Middle East, of course, with Middle Eastern monarchies, it played its role.
But so after the first major package of sanctions in March or whenever it was implemented, how precarious did the situation feel here, and how quickly did you find your footing? How quickly did the expert community, the business community, and the various bits of the government bureaucracy all get together to start working on this problem? Or did everybody start doing it separately?
I think they started to work immediately, particularly the very important role, stabilizing role played central bank, because basically they increased the interest rate immediately. So basically the idea was that for a short period of time, economy must become frozen to avoid any clashes, any collapses. When they realized that, okay, now we can start breathing, they started to change the monetary policy. Current interest rates they're pretty high for Russia, more than 20%, but at that time it worked very well. It was very important stabilizing impetus, and at the same time, lots of people started to find any options because there was no choice whether a business can take a pause and wait or it has to redirect its activities or find another partners abroad. There was no choice. There was just a goal to find other ways how to get money. And when I think it's part of cultural code as well, then when there is no choice and you just must do something, they went and did.
And how easily were these intermediaries and partners found, and how actively did they search out Russian businesses? To what extent did the outside partners do some of the work to meet you in the middle?
I would answer from a bit different angle. If we compare Russian sanctions, like anti-Russian sanctions with anti-Iranian sanctions or any sanction campaign, the key variable here is the role of third countries. To which extent they follow the sanctions or they just don't deal with sanction state and whatever. And I think that a bet of US and Europe that their very intense sanction and media and political campaign against Russia would push other countries either to follow their sanctions or to avoid dealing with Russia, it failed. At the same time, we can say that there was no some generous offer to these countries. There was just a bet on not just coercion, but symbolic role of political messages and that kind of things, because there was no UN Security Council resolution by obvious reasons. There was no official positions of China or India or Middle Eastern countries that they share the views of Europe and the United States that Russia must be sanctioned at all. Without these conditions, sanctions don't work to the same extent they used to work 15 years ago, just because the economic role, economic potential, economic capacity of global majority really increased. So if the same amount of sanctions that was imposed under the same logic, no generous offer to other countries, no UN Security Council resolution, if the same amount of sanctions would be imposed on Russia in 2002, consequences would be much harder. It was
because of the external environment.
Yes, because international system changed completely. It's much easier to survive within the system under sanctions, but it's more expensive to cooperate.
To what extent do you think American policymakers understood this fact? Do you think they meant to destroy the Russian economy, or they understood that there's only so far that they would actually be willing to push a partner like India, so that there are always going to be some doors left pretty wide open and that sanctions weren't ultimately meant to be total?
Frankly speaking, I don't know. Because first state official positions were that Russian economy will be destroyed very soon. Our sanctions would work. It's sanctions from hell and so far so on. So I think that the initial message was to destroy Russian economy as it used to exist by the time very fastly with low costs for states who sanctioned Russia, firstly for the US and Europe as well. I don't believe that Europeans in 2022 really planned that these sanctions are for ages. Otherwise, I think there will be more concerns, at least in some countries. The idea was, okay, we start, we expect fast result, then they realized that there is no fast result. But to achieve this fast result, really to ruin the economy, you have to incorporate China, India, and Middle East in the equation. And you can't incorporate them just by coercion. So you need to offer something. And the offer was too expensive. That's why they decided not to move too deep into that by that time. The example of Thailand is pretty famous when there was an attempt to push Thai authorities to block tourist visits from Russia. And Thai said, okay, we raise pretty good fortune from Russian tourists, just provide us the same amount of money and we will block next day. And the idea was no. And the talk didn't work.
And the same more or less with the Indians and oil, that they say, we need energy, this is cheap, we're going to buy it unless you give us better terms.
Oh, well, I think with India it was more complicated because India...
Or this their famous non-alignment.
It's non-alignment, it's just the biggest population of the world by now, if I'm not mistaken. It's a booming economy, it's the whole logic of new pole of growth worldwide, and those who want to deal with pole of growth has to treat India properly. So I think it's more sophisticated than just oil bargaining. But part of oil bargaining also takes place. That's true.
And self-confidence doesn't have to be sophisticated. But they certainly felt like they had a position in the world where they could afford to do what they wanted and what was in their own interest.
Yep.
So you said that the world had changed, that what might have been possible earlier is impossible now with this sanctioning instrument.
Yep. That
it turned out that sanctions are not a nuclear bomb after all. So what do you think the future of sanctions will be?
Well, I need a crystal globe to answer properly, but as we don't have it in our podcast, I think that sanctions will be on the table of negotiations for sure. It's already presented by both Russian and Americans. But if we imagine the situation that US withdraws lots of sanctions, most of sanctions, some sanctions, no matter. If we imagine that this happens, it means that the whole previous logic of American sanction policy is changed dramatically. Because if we compare American sanctions in 1990s, like La Lista Clinton against drug dealers and drug barons and some small countries, and then 9/11 happens, and war against terrorism is combined with war against financing of terrorism. And here starts the new story of American sanctions, with the financial intelligence helping to monitor inappropriate transactions. And what is more important, because OFAC realized very quickly that there's too many operations that happens in the financial world, and any institution with the smartest AI can't monitor all that. You have to outsource. You have to make your concern not to allow bad people pay to other bad people. You have to outsource it to financial institutions. And it was a very profound shift. And there was no example that for last 25 years, then when you start this crusade against some absolute evil like terrorism, or how it was positioned in American media and politics against Iran that wants to come into nuclear club, you can't stop because you can't bargain with absolute evil. And the whole logic of the sanction campaign against Russia for last especially 3 years, it was the same. There was a sanction crusade against absolute evil. And if we now imagine that, no, sanctions are just a regular tool of foreign policy. It's just when countries have some conflicts, they use one kind of instruments. When they overcome these conflicts, they can use other tools. It's just a very profound shift. And if it happens, and from logical point of view, it should happen because there are just too many countries that can be part of these trade and investment equations. But it will be a new story of American sanctions.
But do you think that the current model of sanctions is suited to this more flexible future? Is it a screw that can turn both ways? Because you say that the enforcement of sanctions was outsourced to the companies themselves that had to hire lawyers and create special departments so that they could manage their own transactions in order to avoid punishment if some audit were to take place. But that they're the ones who do it themselves. And from what I understand, many of them are wary of making changes to this because Congress passes one law today, another tomorrow. You don't want to have to rehire this whole group of lawyers. So maybe better for now just keep in place the same policies. So there's not much adaptability built into this system. So let's say that Rubio proposes to resume economic activities with Russia. How much can the government actually do to roll back sanctions in certain sectors?
First of all, they can deal with SDN list, because SDN list, especially the most recent changes in SDN list, because it's...
Explain what an SDN list is.
Especially designated nations or really truly bad people and companies that any person who wants to deal with America shouldn't deal with members of this SDN list. It can be companies, it can be some particular people, but there are also sectoral sanctions, and there are some laws that were signed both during first Trump presidency, CAATSA, countering American adversaries. I don't remember how it ended up, but CAATSA. And it means that president can withdraw some sanctions only if Congress approves it, if Congress allows it. And now we see that President Trump really has lots of capacities to work productively with Congress, but the limits of this dialogue are unclear, at least for us here. And without this, any key sanctions can't be withdrawn. So sanctions against Russian energy sector, against financial sector, they are put in laws. And some particular bank, yes, okay, you can now switch the light and connect 15 Russian banks to SWIFT, but after tomorrow you can switch them back. It's better than nothing. And I think that if it happens, Russia could profit from that kind of changes, but it's not a sustainable solution at all. Because the system...
So allowing Russian banks access to SWIFT is something that can be done immediately without Congress, but the sanctions against the large sectors of the Russian economy remain in place because those were imposed by Congress and need to be repealed by Congress.
There is also a tool that is called waiver or exemption. So executive authorities in the US can start issuing these waivers and export licenses within some existing sanction programs. It happens. It worked with Iran, for example, by 2010, if I'm not mistaken, like Halliburton worked in Iran by humanitarian waiver or something. General Electric, electricity is good for humanity. That's true. So it's also possible and doable, but it takes a lot of work and very intense dialogue of authorities and business. In this case, it can be institutionalized.
Let's say now everything continues to progress as quickly as it has up to this point in terms of Russian-U.S. relations. And there is some motivation to begin to roll back sanctions. If you were to tell the American side how and where to start, what would you put on that list?
It's a difficult question, actually, because there are some immediate things that can be changed very fast, like next day, the same day, by this exemption or waiver or moves within SDN list. But if we limit our conversation only by these moves, it's almost unimaginable to overcome other sanctions, other sanction limitations. And they would limit most of the activities except some very particular projects. If we raise a question on assets that are frozen, and the part of the American answer is, well, we have only 20 billions and all the rest is mostly in Brussels, deal with Brussels. I don't believe that Russia would accept this answer completely. If we speak about sectoral sanctions against aircraft and aviation industry, one particular waiver for one particular aircraft it can't solve anything systemically. We saw yesterday that the first phase was to set up better diplomatic dialogue, so to set up diplomatic teams that work in both capitals more productively. That's a good sign, because for me it illustrates some openness to really discuss not some situative issues like let's allow Gazprom to set 3 transactions via SWIFT and then we cut it off. It's unsustainable at all, but it takes lots of work within the US, more work domestically than with Russia here.
But so you didn't quite answer the question. So if you had, maybe you are writing such a paper for your own government and then they'll present that in Saudi Arabia. So you said there's a lot of stuff that is complicated and it requires long and persistent work. Are there any big ticket items or small, easily achievable compromises?
Small, easily achievable. It's not a compromise. Well, that's a very important point by here. For Russia, any withdrawal of sanction is not considered as part of compromise. It's considered that United States correct their own mistake.
But if you talk to Trump that way, you're not going to get very far. So you have to present it as mutually beneficial and that the United States economic sector will also gain considerably from removing certain limitations.
Obviously. Well, for President Trump, the rhetoric must be different. It's clear. He likes big projects. He likes big figures. So, of course, if we take a look on Russian economy, it's about energy, it's about finance, it's about services. That's it. Some talk can be about aluminium and titan, but it's very, I think it's secondary issues.
What about uranium?
Well, uranium also can be part, but uranium without answering to energy and finance, it shouldn't be discussed first. It won't be just it would be a nice deal.
Okay, well, it seems like these negotiations will probably take a while, that there's a lot to discuss.
Well, I think the first key point here is to fix the principles, how the whole sanction issue is discussed. Because if we start going sanction by sanction now, I don't remember exactly. All in all, we have more than 20,000 sanctions from all the countries, and the US usually take more than half. So if you go one by one, surname by surname, company by company, and afterwards we turn to sectoral sanctions, well, many people can build their careers within these negotiations, but it will be a too long journey. But the major principles, what we do with assets, what we do with sectoral sanctions, and how president can push the sectoral sanctions back within Congress, and some very practical and fast, low-hanging fruits with SDN or waivers or exemptions. I think that the first step will be more about exemptions and waivers, but it's not the route towards some, how they called it yesterday, new era of bilateral relations. It's not an era. It's just can be a better moment. But we had lots of bad moments in the past 3 years, so it's not very hard to draw something nice.
Yeah, the Chinese have declared a new era. I guess the Russians and the Americans can have a moment. In 2022, circumstances changed quickly. Russian business and its foreign partners had to adapt. The system of interaction and exchange became more complex and many more links were added to the chain. But the people who were operating as intermediaries clearly have benefited. Are there important sectors of society who would not be very happy if sanctions were to be lifted substantially?
Well, there will be some people who wouldn't be happy about that. Any counter-sanction policy means that there is a group of people that know how to profit from sanctions. I think that some concerns now are more in FMCG sector and retail, when many American and European companies left. And now if they want to come back, and the others already invested some money here or just launched or increased their production here, for them it's pretty heavy challenge, and there is a chance that McDonald's comes back and we have Russian analog of McDonald's on the same street and McDonald's here, and they compete for Russian guests because, well, the Russian analog works pretty efficiently.
And the Russian analog just took over the restaurants that McDonald's
but they
had.
renovated most of them. They made a renovation.
So McDonald's has its work cut out for it. If it comes back, it has to find new real estate and...
Or I don't know exactly how the deal was structured, because most of these deals, they were structured very specifically for every particular buyer and seller. There were some management buyouts, and how it's going to work now, it's a very big question. But of course, some Russian companies, retail, if you go around Moscow, you see lots of restaurants, lots of shopping malls that have some brands that we never met before 2022, or they were very small, but now they became pretty big for Russian market.
Chinese brands or other brands?
Chinese, Turkish, Russian brands.
Chinese, Turkish, and Russian.
Yeah. And some Italians still.
Some Italian still.
Yeah.
I know Russian tourists have been able to go to Italy. That's one of the best places to get a visa in Europe, right?
Those who wanted, they could go, but they weren't in the sanction list. They could go to European countries, so to Italy, to France, to Spain. But it wasn't really welcoming. But those who came, they, as I know, they enjoyed shopping in every place they wanted.
That's the only reason to go west, is to buy a purse?
Well, it was funny that Chanel, that has a very famous perfume, Russian Skin, but in French it sounds nicer. And it's like very, very famous that Madame Chanel invented because of her beautiful love towards Russian. And in 2022, they took the title from the bottle. So it was just unnamed boxes. But those who wanted to come to Chanel in Paris and spend $10,000 or 20,000 euros for bags, they could do that.
Because a lot of money that used to flow out of the country was stuck in the country. So when you have a chance to buy a bottle of perfume in France, you take advantage of it. So when was the last time you were in the West, anywhere?
Well, I think a year ago.
A year ago. Where'd you go and for what reason, if you can share?
What for?
You don't have to.
For personal reasons.
Personal reasons. Very good. Okay, now for just the last short segment, I'd like to ask you about this school that you run as dean and the ways in which it perhaps has changed in recent years. So first, a tactless question. How old are you?
I'm 36.
36. So we're pretty much the same, but you're already dean. It seems like there are quite a few young people in important posts in Russia. You might be the record holder.
Well, last week I met with the governor of Yamal-Nenetsk Autonomous Region. It's the key gas-producing province in Russia that produces more gas than Qatar. And he's our age, he's 36, and he's governing for the last 7 years. And that's when I realized that, well, my career sucks completely. No, there are young people.
So how do you explain this? Because obviously from the outside, we see the top leadership, which Putin, Lavrov, and everybody else is of a certain generation. I mean, all the same generation. But underneath, has there been a renewal of sort of new cadres? And when did this start? And what was the impetus?
I feel that for older generation, I mean like 70s, boomers, for them it's easier to deal and to transfer power towards people not like 10, 15 years younger than they are, but to 2 generations down. That's what we see in many areas. Of course, there are some people like our Prime Minister, Mishustin, he's like in between Putin and the 40s. But if we take a look on young rectors of Russian universities, they are about their 40s. So it's not like 55, 60 plus. And not forgetting that those who are 55, 60 plus, many of their careers and career tracks were ruined by 90s. People were trained to become engineers or someone who would be very on demand in Soviet economy, in Soviet country, and then everything crashed. So it was like everything changed. Like if those who graduated with history diploma or literature or philosophy, they just couldn't find money to survive. So they left their career. So they had to raise some money to some commerce, and none of them really became successful. And those who started their careers in 2000s, in late 2000s, it was much easier. It was a prospering country. So if you started from one position, you could imagine some very clear other further steps.
So there's quite a large gulf. So there's the current top elite, which had already begun its career by the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the younger elite coming up that only began in the early 2000s.
So generationally, yeah, it's like kind of children of boomers. So I think it explains some shifts in our government. For example, when we see one of Vice Prime Ministers, Patrushev, he's the son of Nikolai Patrushev. So I think it's a more acceptable logic for transfer. Oreshkin, he's young. He's one of first deputies in presidential administration. If we take a look on the ministers in the government, most of their deputies are very young. So they are about their 40s. But as a dean, I'm one of the youngest in the country, I guess.
Well, and that is something that is not visible at all from the outside, because you see this continuity in leadership, and those are the faces
I think
that
that's the
are
message.
internationally recognized. Yes, this is a
that's the logic. So
frozen and then stable situation.
Yeah, nothing changes. But
in fact, you're saying that in many of the key positions, there are quite young and newly arrived people with different understandings of the world.
The most recent example, our company, state corporation that runs Roscosmos, like Russian space, it was governed by men like about 60s, 70s, closer to 70s, and now it's chaired by a guy who's about 40.
Who doesn't remember anything about the Soviet Union and Gagarin?
But everybody remembers everything about Gagarin. But the key problem is that we have to move beyond Gagarin past. We have to invent something new. And, there is a belief that the young one can move further in this direction.
Well, so let's talk to finish about the very youngest, your students. 3.5 years ago, what did they come to this school to study, and what sort of jobs did they think they were going to get, and what has changed since 2022?
I would say that, first of all, they are much more adaptable than the adults. And they switch to a new reality that they have to apply for a job not to American company, but to Russian company or to a Chinese company, or they have to go for student mobility exchange, not to Germany, but to Korea or to China or to Hong Kong or to Japan. By the way, this year we have students who take Arabic as their major language, and they started their mobility with United Arab Emirates. They're very satisfied. For many of them, actually, the dream career now looks the career in Dubai. Then, if we speak about finance and investment in Dubai, than in New York previously.
And that's not just a result of the war, but also that the world is changing and Dubai is sparkling and the skyscrapers are taller than they are.
Dubai attracts millionaires even from countries who are not sanctioned. And what I can also say about...
But so the trend was already changing even before the rupture.
My faculty is pretty specific because, as I said, we started pivot to this before. So by 2022, we had the School of Oriental Studies that attracts lots of students annually, more than 180 annually of newcomers just for Oriental Studies. We had Oriental languages, Chinese, Arabic, Japanese for our world economists, for those who take international relations as their major. We also had a program of dual diploma program with Korean University, Kyunhee. So many students were eager to go to Asia before, not because they couldn't go to France, for example, but because the choice was made and they want to work with Asia. And
what have the results been? So those early specialists in Eastern countries, have they already put that to use? Is there a network of Russians who are ready to tie Russia to the global majority, as you call it?
They are on demand, and Russian labor market now is overheated. We have a strong deficit of well-qualified specialists on most of the positions. That's why, like my third-year students, we have 4 years for undergrad, who takes world economy, for example. On the third year, the students who don't work, that's only students who don't want to work, because the market is ready to take them for short internships, for various options. So they're very on demand. But I still believe that we don't have enough experts to work with world majority. And with alumni of Soviet universities from Africa, from Asia, for about 20 to 30 years, it was mostly a forgotten asset. That's why we have a lot of work to do.
But so you were rediscovering these Soviet connections, finding Africans who once studied in Moscow and rekindling these associations?
Well, for our faculty, it's a bit different. I believe that for Russian companies who want to work abroad, who want to work in Africa and global majority markets, they have to invest in raising Russian specialists. But it takes a lot of time. It's like 5-6 years. If we take a student who comes who doesn't speak any Oriental language, and he also has to learn, economics, logistics, business, cross-cultural communication, and whatever, and get some practical experience experience. Or you invite a master student from targeted country. He studies there for 2 years, gets some Russian experience and connections, and then comes back and work for a Russian company. It's much faster. It's what we can do in years, not in generations. So we try to mix these activities. But it goes very hardly.
Oh, I was about to say that you had presented a very tough negotiating position, that the West isn't even interesting after all, that Dubai and Shanghai are much more enticing than London and New York.
Of course, some students are interested of going to London or to New York, but I mean, for them, it wasn't so heartbreaking and ruining their picture of the future. Those who want, they still can go. That's the point. And some of them go. But many of them are eager to find any low-hanging opportunities. They understand that fast careers are built to either when empire is growing or when empire is destroying. They want to build their empires on the new markets.
Let's end on empires growing and collapsing. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, seems to be a rule of history, but we will see which empires go in which direction.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Trilog podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trilog podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.